Well, this season, some people get rid of things. I'm trying to recapture three words, three important words. I'm trying to say the words, I forgive you, a bit more, and I'm trying to mean it as well. But it's not working out as well as I thought, but not for the reason you think. I was at Schnucks the other day, and I had a cart, and I went to grab one of the smaller carts, and then there was a woman who was blocking my way out of the little cart corral area, and she didn't realize that she was in my way. Finally, she did without me saying anything. I tried to be gentle, and she goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I said, "I forgive you." And she looked at me like I was crazy, right? Because I think when I said, "I forgive you," she was hoping for maybe, "It's okay. It's fine." But you know, sin is a serious deal. It's not okay. It's not fine. We take it so seriously that as Christians, we actually take time to look in ourselves and say, there's sin in there, and we need to deal with it. And it has a cost, and so as we journey forward, we're going to see that the cost is actually Jesus on a cross. So we say, I forgive you, because it's not okay, it's not fine. Something needs to be forgiven. Well, we've been trying to give you handles on understanding what sin is, how we're captive to it, why it's actually a problem. So you've heard sin as idolatry, to trust in other gods other than the true God. We're going to talk about lawlessness, falling short. We're going to talk about adultery. And then today, we are talking about sin as rebellion. Rebellion. So rebellion, to rebel, requires a relationship, right? There has to be a relationship against which to rebel. In our case, we're talking about the relationship we have with the Creator God. To rebel against a relationship that was meant for our good. Also, rebellion can be against a boundary or a constraint. We're talking about sin as rebellion, that there was actually a boundary God created. God created the world to work a certain way. And we rebelled, we overstepped that boundary that God put in place for our benefit, so that we would have life. So sin as rebellion. So there are boundaries that we rebel against, but what you need to know is that boundaries, and I think you would agree, are a good thing. Boundaries are good in relationships. When you first got into a relationship, maybe you thought you were really doing well at loving the other person, and then they're like, hey, that doesn't really do it for me, right? They have boundaries and ways in which they desire to be loved. With school, you have boundaries. You need to have boundaries. You need to study the night before, and then you need to call it quits, get some rest, take the test tomorrow. There has to be boundaries. At work, you have boundaries. Your boss comes to you and says, I have a new project for you. And you look at your job description and you say, that is not mine. And in that instance, you really like having boundaries. Boundaries are important for relationships like in-laws and family. We can make it to Thanksgiving, but we can't make it to Christmas and Thanksgiving, right? Boundaries are a very good thing. And then there's also good news. God has boundaries. And you might think that it's just some rules, some words that God said, but it's much more than that. No, the boundaries that God created are actually at creation. Baked into the fabric of how the world works, God created with boundaries. And so out of nothing, by his word, he creates, and then he created light and dark. And there had to be boundaries, right? Because in the light you can see, but you need the dark so that it's easier to rest. There was water and there was sky, right? And that's important so that we're not all just floating off into wherever. But then, even more important, there was water and there was land, right? And that was important because if there was going to be any creatures created, we don't want to just be treading water, but there's land that has a purpose and water. God himself put birds in the air because that's how they breathe. He put fish in the sea because they do better in water than not, right? created plants and animals and humans, and he created boundaries. He said, humans, take care of all the animals and the plants. You can eat them, but you don't eat one another. Don't eat humans. There are boundaries baked into creation. But when God made these boundaries, he also said, everything's for you. Take it all. Everything I've created is good, and I made it for you. And so the sky, the water, the plants, the animals, everything was good. But then he looked at his creation that was human beings, and he said, this is not just good, this is very good. And so God created boundaries, and he said, this is such good news that I now have an object by which I can love and care for, and they are going to live within the boundaries I've created because I've already given them everything, and they don't need anything else. But there was another boundary. There was a tree in the middle of the garden, and he said, I already gave you everything, but don't cross this boundary in the middle. Don't touch it. Don't eat the fruit that's on that tree. And nevertheless, we overstepped the boundary. We broke it. It just wasn't enough for us. We needed more. It's called rebellion. Rebellion against God, the relationship we have with him, rebellion against the boundaries, what was set out for us. And there's a certain language, as I was reflecting this last week, about rebellion, surrounding rebellion. So I'm going to share some words with you. I hope it resonates. Rebellion. What do we say when we rebel? Sometimes we say it quietly, but this one you say out loud. Is anybody have a child that's in the no phase of life? Is anybody stuck? Okay, I see a couple hands. No, right? Like, that is their word. No. You can give them food, you can give them things they need, and for some reason, it doesn't process in their minds. They say no. They don't want your good and gracious care, right? No. This last week, there was a play space down at Reliant. We actually have times where mothers and their children get together, and this younger generation, God bless us all, they actually try to offer some more autonomy to children, like they get to make their own decisions, and it's good in some instances, until there's like a mother dragging their child to go play, and the child says no. But the autonomy goes out the window, and you say, I know what's best for you. I'm not a parent, but I get horrified sometimes when there's a child on one of those backpack leashes, right? And I go, how could a parent do that? And then they're like, you don't know how rebellious they can get. You put the backpack leash on. Well, if a child says no, I know as adults we can still say no as well, but think about a teenager then. The language of rebellion. I thought of these words. I know better. I know better. Nathan, here's how you mow the lawn. I know better. I got a different way to do it, right? As you get older, you look at your parents and you find out who they voted for in the last election, and you say, I know better than them, right? I know better. The last phrase I want to give to you is this, and it's kind of once you're done saying no or I know better, and you're just ready to live without any bounds or constraints and ignore God completely, you might say these words. It doesn't even matter. Why bother? Just ignore God. Why listen to an archaic writings and an archaic God who's oppressive and restrictive and tells me not to do things that I want to do? It doesn't even matter. Why have boundaries at all? Well, the story we get today is a story about breaking boundaries. It's about overstepping what God has for us. And so it says there was a serpent. We count that as evil. It's like Satan. Satan exists because of rebellion against God and his word and those boundaries. And so there's actually the boundary, I'll remind you, of the tree in the middle of the garden. But one day, as Adam and Eve are going about the garden, they come to this tree, and I'd imagine that Adam and Eve are still together. It's not like Eve is off doing her own thing. And Adam is meant to take care of Eve. Eve is also to be in relationship with Adam. But then you get this exchange where the serpent, Satan, gets to say something. I want to read this together, actually. This is what he says. Can we read it together? Did God actually say? Did he really say you can't have this? Did God really say there was a boundary that you weren't supposed to cross? Right, all you have to do is question it. Because even if you have the question in your mind, you're already thinking, well, maybe he didn't say it that way. And Satan, as he is, he twists God's words and what the command and what the boundaries actually were. He blurs the boundaries so that did God actually say, well, no, maybe not. And the language of rebellion goes into play. Here's the next lie he says. Let's read this together. You will not surely die. I know better. You're not going to die. Now, the funny thing about this is anytime someone says you will not surely die, it kind of comes in like, I hadn't even considered that I would die when doing this, right? But no, he's saying, you're not going to surely die. I know better. It's the language of rebellion. You know, there's something funny with that word, I know better. I was thinking about this in terms of, I have friends who, you know, they kind of grew up in rebellious ways, right? And maybe you know those people too. But they grow up in rebellious ways, living a life that you think might be kind of cool or edgy or fast and loose. And then sometimes when they actually come to know Jesus and be loved by him, they carry this wild story about all these things they've done in the past and all these times when they said, I know better, right? And they share these stories with you. And if you're a boring person in the church who's just always been in the faith, raised by your parents to know Jesus all the time, you hear these stories and you think, that is so cool. The funny thing about it is that anyone who's lived that kind of rebellious life will also say, I wouldn't wish that life on anyone. The pain, the heartache, the loneliness I went through, I wouldn't want that on anyone. It's not cool, don't get me wrong. But somehow, you and I hear these stories, and we still explore the boundaries. We might even say, I know better than them. Well, the last one isn't words from Satan, it's just what happens. It says, Eve, it doesn't even matter. So read this with me. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, she crossed the boundary that God set. She took it, she ate it, she gave it to Adam. And let's be honest, Adam, he failed Eve. He was the one who sinned first. He was meant to take care of her. This isn't about some weak, gullible woman. No, this is about a joint venture where Adam was meant to protect and care for the creation God gave to him. But they crossed the boundary. Well, immediately after the crossing of the boundary, they discover some things about themselves. They discover shame. They didn't have any clothes, and so they try to hide from God, which is a funny thought in itself. But then the consequences roll out as God talks with them. He says, I gave you everything, but you didn't want it. You crossed the boundary, and so now every part of your life is going to be about earning. Even in your relationship to one another, you're going to have to earn love. Actually, if you want a family, you're going to have to earn it. There's going to be some pain involved. If you want to be able to eat, you're going to eat actually by the sweat of your brow. You're going to have to work the ground. I gave everything to you, but you stepped outside the boundary, and now you're going to have to earn it. Well, then it gets even more painful because God says, if this is what you want, and honestly, if you want to go about this rebellious way in sin, God will let you have what you want. He sets another boundary around the garden and says, you're outside of it. You can have what you want and be by yourselves, be your own God, control everything according to how you want it. And see, we live outside that boundary now. and we know that it is painful. So how does God deal with rebellion? How does God deal with rebellion? Well, even as Adam and Eve are discovering all these consequences and the results of their overstepping the boundary, God even still makes a promise. He says there's going to come a time where I'm going to send one who actually crushes Satan, but it's going to come at a cost. See, the one who crushes this serpent is also going to be bit, and it's going to be painful for that person. And so what we see happening in the gospel is that there was no boundary between heaven and earth, but God himself actually came down to be one of us, to rescue us, to bring us back to himself. Boundaries gone because God came to rescue you. And it says that he was the one who was crushed. On his body, the sin of the world, he goes to a cross, buried in the ground, sin crushed, evil and death crushed underneath Jesus' body. See, because sin has a cost. So God is going to deal with rebellion by sending Jesus. But I want to make it a little bit more personal. How does God deal with your rebellion? See, like I said, he'll let you go do it. You can live how you want. There will be some consequences. Your relationships will break. You'll do some embarrassing things. You might even feel shame, but at some point you might just say it doesn't even matter. You can live the rebellious life you've always wanted. But you showed up at worship, and my guess is you don't want to live that life. You want to wave the white flag and surrender and say, I'm done being rebellious. I don't want to live this way. I know the pain I've caused others. I know the pain I've experienced myself. And God, I know what I've done to you. And if that is who you are and where you are today, Jesus meets you wherever you are, even in your rebellion, and he rescues you. See, this Jesus who was sent crosses the boundary from heaven to earth. He actually says these words later in the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm wondering if they've been meaningful to you in the past, but I'll read them again and talk about them in a certain way. This is from Matthew chapter 11. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. There's a lot of rooms here at Christ Memorial, everybody, a lot of hidden stuff everywhere, and I went searching with Larry, and I found exactly that. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. And I'm guessing it's supposed to go like this. It's a little bit broken, but the whole point is that it's for work animals, right? You're supposed to pull some kind of plow or work device behind you. You get yoked, and Jesus says, take upon my yoke because it's lighter. And I'm trying to think, what kind of yoke is Jesus describing? Is he saying that it's like a designer yoke, like a luxury yoke? Maybe it's like cleaner. I know I'm making a mess, and I apologize to the Altar Guild if you dry clean this stuff. But I'm just trying to think, what kind of yoke is Jesus giving? Is it that the work behind you isn't really, happening? What's going on? And it strikes me that maybe Jesus is describing the yoke this way. It's not a singular yoke. Pulling the plow wasn't a solitary sport, but rather that Jesus is yoked to you. That your life is connected to his. That you're yoked, but you're yoked to Jesus. Paul says, he became sin who knew no sin, so that you may become the righteousness of God. Everything that's wrong and rebellious in you, you now become yoked to Jesus. He ties his life to yours. He does not give up on you. He finds you in your rebellion, and he ties you to his life. And so when Jesus goes to the cross, he takes you along with him, all the sin of the world on his body that is broken and buried, but rises to new life so that you end up forgiven. Your life tied to his, yoked to Jesus. But I think it goes even a little bit further. I want to show you this next picture. See, this is maybe how the two big hosses, right, in the yoke, they'd be on there and they're pulling the plow. There's a certain way about how a yoke would work and how you would make two animals work together. See, there would be a trained oxen and then an untrained oxen. And to train the untrained oxen, what you would do is connect it to the trained one in a double yoke like we have in this picture. And see, the good news is that Jesus is trained. He knows where to go. He knows the boundaries. He knows where life is and how life is to be lived. But I can't imagine that we wouldn't consider ourselves anything but the untrained oxen. See, because even being forgiven and having your new life in Jesus, we buck one way or another. We cross boundaries. We step and go into places we are not meant to go and we're not supposed to be. There's actually another word for sin that I want to bring up. It's something I grew up with when I was learning the Lord's Prayer. I learned the words in the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." And for the longest time, when I learned that trespass was sin, I thought we were trying to kind of gloss over how bad sin was and trespass was taking place of it. But now that I think about it, and I hear this language about Jesus yoking us to himself, I think it actually helps us quite a bit. See, because to trespass is to go somewhere you are not supposed to go. To trespass is to be somewhere that you are not meant to be. And we know that we trespass all the time, even when we are with Jesus. You open up an internet browser, you turn on a certain setting that makes you invisible, untraceable. Down the rabbit hole you go. You've trespassed. You have a relationship or you meet somebody. You start talking, you're texting. And then you decide to meet up alone, just the two of you. Somehow when you meet up, one thing happens to another, certain things come off. And then you start using your bodies in ways God didn't meant for you. You went somewhere you were not supposed to go. And see, the difficulty about it is that God actually created some of these things that we actually rebel against. He created them so that we would have life and intimacy and goodness and that we would experience God's love. But when we misuse it, when we trespass and go to places we should not go and are not meant to go, we end up calloused, sometimes towards God and even towards others, unwilling to receive love. You want stuff. You want to make money. And so you ignore everyone around you so that they don't get in your way. You ignore family, you ignore responsibilities so you can just make more money. But then you trespass again, that's not enough. You use people. Everyone else becomes a bit player in your story, and you're the movie star, and you'll manipulate and trick and use others to get what you want, more for yourself. You went somewhere you weren't supposed to go. You went somewhere you weren't meant to be. You've trespassed. Can we go to the next slide? Do you remember? You are yoked to Jesus. Jesus goes with you when you trespass. He goes with you every step of the way. Does it make you nervous? Is it bad news that Jesus was there when you did that thing, crossing that boundary? Or is there good news to be had? That Jesus didn't find you disgusting. He saw you in your rebellion and he didn't think you were too far gone. Jesus himself did the yoking. He yoked himself to you and said he would never let you go, even in your rebellion. How does God deal with rebellion? He never gives up on you. He sticks himself to you. He doesn't find you disgusting. He's not surprised by the rebellion. He makes you his own. And then he makes you a new creation, yoked to him. There's that conversation about training, right? If I'm the rebellious work animal and Jesus is the one who knows the way, how do I be trained? A couple different theories, philosophies behind it. I could read you some do's and don'ts. You might forget those by the time you leave here. I could maybe even withhold Jesus' forgiveness. Say you can't have it till you clean up. You can't have it till you stop being so rebellious. But thank God I didn't yoke myself to you. Jesus did. So he's going to give his forgiveness away. He's going to forgive you and make you his own. And the thing that's so hard for some of us to understand right now because we love boundaries in relationships is that the gospel doesn't seem to have those same boundaries. Jesus lets you take a pound of flesh. Jesus lets you hurt him. Yet he comes to life with a new body and makes you his own. The training is learning to be forgiven. The training is learning to receive mercy. The training is to learn how to say not no, but yes, Jesus. Jesus, you know better. Jesus, everything you've done, it matters. That's the training for us today, even in our rebellion. Jesus yokes himself to you. He goes with you this week, and that is very good news. Amen.